Hello, everyone, and welcome to another week of Introduction to Human Rights. First of all, I just want to thank you all for really, I think, the high quality of blog posts you've been doing. I think they're really good. They look nice. You're addressing all the topics and sort of digging deep into the discussion prompts. Really appreciate that. I've tried to give some feedback in past weeks where I think there's areas for improvement, and I've seen a lot of you really run with those recommendations. So I sincerely appreciate that. It's made my role as instructor enjoyable to read these posts every week and see what you all have to say. So this past week, your blog posts were looking at international conflicts and the concept of international humanitarian law, or in other words, human rights as affected during an armed conflict. So you wrote about several different conflicts. Some of you wrote about ongoing drug-related violence in Mexico, about the ongoing war in Afghanistan, about the humanitarian situation faced by the Rohingya minority in Burma, conflict between China and Japan over island territory ownership in the East China Sea, the civil war in Syria. So several different conflicts from different regions in the world. And I think one thing that you'll note about those conflicts is when you read last week about the development of the Geneva Conventions and the frameworks of international humanitarian law, those laws were built to respond to the most recent wars. In other words, World War II. So World War II was a major worldwide conflict between state parties with uniformed combatants, militaries fighting one another on the battlefield. Certainly, these conflicts led to horrific civilian casualties and abuses. But the nature of those wars, World War II looked very different than any of the conflicts that you wrote about last week, with the possible exception of the conflict in the East China Sea, which is in fact a conflict between two nation states, China and Japan, although fortunately that is not yet an actual armed conflict, and it doesn't show immediate signs of becoming one, although there's certainly a risk. But when you look about the situation, the civil war in Afghanistan, civil war in Syria, the domestic wars with numerous outside actors intervening, but they are civil wars at heart, and had a lot to do with terrorism, particularly the war in Afghanistan. And then when you look at the Rohingya situation in Burma, it's the unique rights of a minority group within a country. And then the conflict in Mexico, a whole new dynamic of conflicts resulting from the drug trade. So war in the 21st century thus far has looked quite different from war in the 20th century when these international humanitarian law frameworks, the Geneva Conventions, were put in place. So this week, the topic will be looking at some of the new realities and challenges that are faced in 21st century conflict and how international humanitarian law applies, has tried to adapt, and really what are some things that should be done moving forward. So you do some reading in the Haas textbook. You're going to look at a website on torture and kind of dig into those issues. And then we're going to look at another specific conflict. So last week, I asked you to all read about what's going on in Venezuela, kind of a continually evolving situation. You all talked about the human rights violations that were taking place in that country, the horrible realities faced by that citizen's countries, and then I asked, or by that country's citizens, and then I asked you to answer the question, if a civil war were to break out, if armed conflict were to break out between Guaido, who's declared himself president, and Maduro, the current president, would the United States and other countries be justified in intervening militarily under just war principles or humanitarian assistance principles? So I was interested to find, out of 10 blog posts that I read this morning, 6 of you pretty much said yes, military intervention by the United States or other actors would be justified because of the human rights violations and the humanitarian situation on the ground that would justify it. 2 of you said no, military intervention would not be justified because it either wouldn't meet the exact criteria of just war principles or it would just make things worse. And then 2 of you gave sort of nuance. Yes, maybe it would be justified, but it would have to be very carefully thought out and very narrow scope of intervention. So I was interested to see, a pretty large majority said yes, it would be justified. Now, in fairness, I asked, would it be justified under these principles? I did not ask whether you think it would be a good idea or not, because something being justified may or may not be a good idea. So with that in mind, this week I'm going to ask you to look at a different conflict, which is the conflict in Afghanistan. So 17 years ago, when I would have been a senior in high school at this time, the country was faced with a similar question. Would military intervention be justified by the United States in another country? Now, our original mission in Afghanistan was in direct response to the September 11th terrorist attacks. The Taliban, or the government that controlled Afghanistan at the time, had sheltered and supported Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, who perpetrated the September 11th attack. So the immediate mission of U.S. intervention in Afghanistan was in order to retaliate against that attack, to find and eliminate Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, essentially to punish the Taliban for supporting this terrorist network. However, that mission greatly expanded. The Taliban is one of the most brutal regimes. We talked a couple weeks ago about human rights violations that women face in Saudi Arabia. Under the Taliban in Afghanistan is just significantly worse situation for women, other minority groups, numerous human rights violations. So our mission in response to that expanded to removing the Taliban and installing a new democratic government that would respect human rights and would be more in line with modern norms. Now, 17 years later, unfortunately, this has proven to be a long, bloody, and difficult affair with mixed results at best. And presently, for the first time, the United States, the Afghan government, and the Taliban are involved in direct negotiations to work towards a peace agreement. And President Donald Trump has expressed multiple times a desire to remove all U.S. troops and a U.S. military presence from Afghanistan. Now, this has led to mixed reviews. Some people are very supportive of that. They would say that the war has gone on too long. We're not making the gains. A military solution is not possible in that country, and we need to bring our troops home. Others argue that removing the United States military presence altogether would allow the Taliban to just completely take back control of the country and roll back the human rights gains that have been made in the country since the war started in 2002. So reflecting on sort of your approach to what's happening in Venezuela, should we intervene, should we not intervene, I'd like you to take a look at the conflict in Afghanistan. Retrospectively, we have intervened. Where are we at now? And I would like your opinion on how the United States should move forward in that conflict. So I've posted all the materials, some readings from the textbook and a few articles with differing opinions on the situation in Afghanistan. I'd like you to read those over and complete your next blog post, and do continue working on your human rights essay and oral presentation assignment. If you do have any questions about that, please let me know. As always, I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week and a good weekend. Take care.